everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. I'm Katy Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State, and I'm very excited to have you with us for today's Preservation Book Club Author Talk with Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani. And I want to say thank you to our program sponsor, the Peggy N. and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust, who underwrite all of our Preservation Book Club webinars. We are here to talk about The Cities We Need, Essential Stories of Everyday Places by Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani. This is an expressive book of prose and photographs that reveals the powerful ways our everyday places support our shared belonging. Where would you take someone on a guided tour of your neighborhood? And that question kind of spurs a lot of this exploration throughout the book, including photographs and stories and everyday places that are meaningful to everyday people. A little bit about the author. Dr. Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani is a visual urbanist and co-founder of the interdisciplinary studio Buscata. Her first book, Contested City, Art and Public History as Mediation at New York's Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, was a finalist and honoree for the Brendan Gill Award. A widely exhibited photographer, she was a professor of urban studies at the New School for a decade and a fellow at both the International Center of Photography and the Center for Urban Community Research at Goldsmiths University of London. She holds a doctorate in environmental psychology from the Graduate Center at CUNY, and we are very excited to have her with us today to talk about her beautiful new book. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Katie. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. And thank you so much to the Preservation League for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to share this work with all of you. So as Katie said, I'm Gabrielle Bendiner-Viani. I'm a photographer and writer and an urbanist, environmental psychologist, and really two things have been key to me in all of that work is both valuing people's lived experience and their expertise, and in art making as a way of knowing. And a big part of what I do is to try and bring those two things together in my work. I began this work of asking people for their guided tours of their neighborhoods over 20 years ago in both Brooklyn and in Oakland. And so in many ways, both these stories are other people's stories, but also they've really shaped both my research and understanding of the world, but also really of my life. And so, all of these pieces, I think about this work as something that is quite personal as well as about trying to understand different questions of our world. I'm going to read a little bit from the book just so you can hear both the feeling of the book and also some of the voices that are inside the book. Because I think kind of hearing the voices of people is really an important part of this. And then I look forward to everybody's conversation and questions afterwards. So way back in 2001, when I asked Mike in Prospect Heights how he had prepared to take me on the tour of his neighborhood that I had asked him for, he explained, well, I said to myself, we'll take a walk around the block and I'll tell you what I know, And so much of the work of being human happens in everyday places. We become ourselves, we become able to see each other, to become a community. Everyday places are personal, but also global, intertwining history, emotion, and memory. They're experienced, talked about, negotiated, and woven into our lives. We create places, and in turn, they create us. It's not too much to say that these small public and semi-public spaces have the potential to be spaces of liberation. It's in these spaces that we find the cities we need. So what are these, remarkable everyday spaces, right? They're often thought of as banal. They're supermarkets like this one in Prospect Heights. They're sidewalks, they're diners, they're bus stops, they're churches, they're meeting places, they're barber shops, they're the office of a car repair office, they're barber shops, they're donut shops, they're laundromats, they're meat markets, unexpected spaces, as much as the expected ones like parks and libraries. So the work that these places do helps us to become ourselves and to become communities, laying the groundwork, I would say, doing nothing less than laying the groundwork for a functional society. And that's what I explored in this work and over these 20 years and in this book. And I call that work placework. So I'd like to read to you two stories to bring these voices in first. First, from Tanya. in Prospect Heights. And she says, I really like this place. And Prospect Heights is the neighborhood in Brooklyn. She says, I really like this place. Besides the fact that you see different people, you just hear people talking, joshing around. It's a very mixed crowd in here, race, sex, age. You see people from all different backgrounds. You see cops come in here. You see sanitation. You see park police. You see plumbers, accountants, politicians, and you hear people talking trash. It's funny. Mike gives the place its life because he'll talk to anybody and he'll talk crap with anybody. Here in New York, America, you have this whole thing about being somebody and being somebody of a certain level, the doctor, the lawyer, the Wall Street, whatever. And you have people who have a life, run on Jeanette, make people happy. You know, they make people happy. They like it, they come back. They don't like it, they don't come back. It appeals to me very viscerally. It makes me realize, yeah, have to be a big thing that you do. I feel that they love it, and that makes me like it also. If I'm in a bad mood and I come in here, I walk out in a better mood. It's just the place. It's comfortable, you know? And incidentally, that's Mike's place, who I had just talked about, who took me on one of those first walks. And let's hear also from Marty. So this is Oakland, obviously looks quite different. But I think one of the things that I found to be most important in the work and in doing comparative work was to see how very physically different looking places did quite similar important sorts of work for the people who lived there. So Marty took me to this corner and sort of pointed around, and he said, this is Telegraph Avenue and 34th Street in Oakland, if you happen to know it. And he pointed around and he said, this neighborhood was pretty solidly Black. Lois and I grew up 2 blocks further down, but we were up here all the time. We used to hit the plum trees up there. The hospitals were there, but they were much smaller. If you look at this neighborhood, it was a lot more prosperous commercially because there were houses in here under the freeway. There were people here. I would babysit for all the kids here, just as they would babysit for me. Lois has her dad's complexion and looks, and her dad was a red cap. You know, the red caps were the porters. You can never forget. Jack would be coming home from work with that uniform on, and I'd say, I always wanted to be like him. And he'd say, no, 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 boy, you don't want to do this kind of work. This is the same kind of work your great uncle did. My great uncle Frank was a Pullman porter too, but he worked out of Chicago and LA for the Southern Pacific. Well, Frank got a master's degree from the University of Chicago in 1921. Where the hell was he going to work? No one was going to hire him. But this is why you had this degree of progressivism among these Pullman porters, because so many of them were much better educated than the people that were actually on the train. And so what we saw on this block was not the kind of blight that you see now, the people going to work every day, Black men going to work every day. So early on in my work in both Oakland and in Brooklyn, as I was hearing these stories and thinking about all the ways that these people were weaving these huge histories into these very, very small places, right? Early on, someone challenged what it might be the purpose of knowing about everydayness. And they asked, to what use could this project be put? And so thinking of the then recent losses in New Orleans in the wake of 2005's Hurricane Katrina, which there have been many subsequent ones, I answered that if you understood everyday life and you really understood how a place functioned, how it worked, then if some sort of natural disaster occurred, you'd know how to rebuild. You would know what was missing in the wake of that disaster, not just the physical, but what that place did. And in subsequent years, I mulled over this question of use or purpose of this work, sometimes rejecting it outright, and sometimes allowing it to spark new questions. One of those times was in the public work that I started to make from this project as well. So when I returned to Prospect Heights in 2014, after having been away for almost 10 years, I was inspired to create the Intersection Prospect Heights Public Art and Dialogue project from these guided tours. And it was because I realized that a natural disaster hadn't happened, but that a man-made one had. I saw the damage wrought by the gentrification accelerated by the Atlantic Yards and Barclays Center arenas, very large-scale development at the edge of the neighborhood. New expensive infill development, much higher residential and commercial rents had arrived with people who could pay, and in preparation for wealthier people that landlords imagined would arrive when the development was finished. So many of the small businesses, my tour guides, so all of these people, I talk about them as my tour guides because I had asked them for tours. Many of these places that people had said were so crucial to them were vulnerable and priced out. And I wanted to be able to hold on to those stories and bring them back into this space. And so I'm just showing you two pieces of that project that were a series of basically guidebooks that I made to the neighborhood and a series of guided walks that we did as a way to tell these stories and put them back in place and help people recognize and think about how to talk about the basically really rapid change, but by looking at them at that point, really not too distant past. So many of the places that people took me to, and many of the places in the stories were at risk. And it seemed really important to make a space for people to talk about that. So the everyday, just to think about why to do this work in the first place, and even to think about what's the purpose of it, it's really tricky to write about and actually very tricky to ask people about because it can feel both and also very nothing and everyday and people are constant, right? So I think becomes a way to understand the many are all in flux in with place. So placework is the dynamic, reciprocal work that everyday places do for and with individuals and communities, enabling us to grow into being ourselves and enabling us to be together. So by doing these two things, helping us become ourselves and helping us to become communities, these places really do nothing short of creating the conditions for a functional society. So this book really tries to look at that. And so it tells these stories through both the stories that people told me as we went on our walks or drives in Oakland, but also in the stories that people told me after I photographed the places that they had taken me to. And I brought the photographs back to them. Like Lois here is looking at a photograph of a place she had taken me to. And so these places where people can become themselves, those are the stories that Tanya was telling me at the diner, or Lois told me and Marty told me too on neighborhood streets, right? People told me these stories also of becoming part of a community or feeling like they were connected to something larger, or at least had the capacity to be with strangers was what I heard from Tewolde in the donut shop in Oakland, right? Or Neville in the electronics store in Brooklyn, and you'll hear from them in a little bit. So these spaces I could see fostered also a kind of crucial sort of talk and became spaces not just for kind of being with other people, but also offering an opportunity for really low stakes way of practicing negotiation, which I think becomes so important at this moment in time and really always, because if you can't practice at a low stakes way, negotiation and the capacity to disagree, then when the stakes are much higher, we are not in practice to actually talk with each other. So I want to bring in two more voices, that of Tewolde in the donut shop, and then for you to hear from Neville. And let's hear from Tewolde first. Jeez. So this is the donut shop that he took me to in Oakland. And he said, this is on Telegraph and 42nd, and it is actually still there. He said, I was one of the first Eritrean refugees that came to the United States in the 1980s. And there were lots of organizations to support the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, fighting for independence from Ethiopia. Golden Gate Donut Cafe. We used to sit there all day. I'm not kidding you. When I say all day, I mean all day. There were hardly any people there, just like now. But, you know, it's always been like that. Those of us who didn't work on weekends We'd get in the mornings, we'd have donuts and just sit there, smoke and sit until it's time for the meeting. And at that time, it wasn't political so much as getting to know other Eritreans, just being friends and starting in this new place. The guys didn't mind us sitting there all day and, filling the place up with smoke. We sat here and this is what we saw, he said, pointing to this photograph. People would come in, buy donuts and coffee and leave. We just sat there. Actually, people still frequented this long after independence too, but I haven't been there since then. So different places, different buildings have different emotions and different memories. And we'll go back across country and hear from Neville with the electronics. This is on Vanderbilt Avenue in Prospect Heights. My friend, who was in the same electronics business like me, died, and they closed the store with all his stuff inside. He was a cricketer in the West Indies, and his friends, who were his old cricketers, they used to meet every Thursday around that table, have their drink. 2 years ago, he passed away. They still meet every Thursday afternoon that same way. And he was pointing to this boarded up electronics store and saying everybody met in the back. He went to the hospital for a checkup and they found something and they operated. And when they operated, he died. See, everything's still here. The store hasn't been touched. If I need anything, I'm short of anything, instead of buying it, I get it from him. So what does all of this mean, right? I've never been bored by anyone's answer to the question, where would you take me on a guided tour? And not that it's important that I stay interested, but I never know what will come out of someone's mouth, nor what surprising connections between people will emerge. So each tour makes clear the complex, contradictory people that we all are. So to come back to that rankling question about purpose from so many years ago, how can we use the place work that I talk about in this brief talk, but also throughout this book, right? Or how to put it another way, what if we continue to ignore the essential work that places do for people? So a friend of mine, Marina Zarate, who's also was the former president of Habitat International Coalition America Latina, she talks about the idea that the meaning of justice necessarily includes all the dimensions of social life, political, economic, cultural, spatial, and environmental, right? And talks about the notion of a just city in which the goal of economic activities of a city is collective well-being, right? It's not for the economics itself, that the goal of a city is its inhabitants' well-being. Not the city as an investment vehicle, not towers inhabited by global capital, but the city as doing necessary work for people to become themselves and to become community. For the city not to work people, but for the city to work for them. For people to have a right to the city, a right to a city that does place work, right? So that political crises, as I think we all know, are ongoing, right? It is the norm in a 24-hour news cycle. And I remain most concerned, or one piece of what I really feel like is sometimes at the crux of much of this, is a crisis of place and a crisis of dialogue. And so much has been written about, and kind of hear it all the time, around a post-fact time in the wake of leadership across the globe, right? So Trump in the United States, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Putin in Russia, or Modi in India, right? That has led to divided societies wherein stating facts seems to have very little bearing on many people's opinions. And so while that's incredibly infuriating, I think this is actually where we can learn most from my tour guides, and from the places in which they were able to build themselves and then share themselves with people that they did not know and may not have agreed with. The job of place work seems more crucial and more threatened than ever. We're also in a moment when Polarization simplifies and dulls identity and individual stories. When so much of our time is spent on protecting our most basic human needs to stay alive, we lose the ability to share and protect the parts of us that are the most human, right? We're losing places that are the places that facilitate our sharing of the weird, specific, funny, surprising parts of ourselves, the sharing that helps us genuinely connect. And the things about people that have really kept me also interested in asking for people's guided tours over 20 years. So I do think that there's actually much that we can do. And the reason to do it isn't that equity, justice, and fairness are simply the right way to behave. It is also true. But the reason to do it is existential. The work that everyday places do, just going to go back for a minute, the policies that prioritize a right to the city, that the things that those would support, that work is what enables all of us to become ourselves, to be a functional society. And without that, we are nothing but consumers, data to be bought and sold, nothing more unique than what the artificial intelligence that trawls our online detritus can create. If we want to be human, we need placework. And without it, we can't get to the cities we need. I'm going to close with one more story that's actually from just down the block from this image. And I will say this image was made for Cynthia, who said to me, you know, one of the things that this work does was she said, you know, these places that you're talking about or that people keep taking you to, they help us figure out how to relate to these bigger worlds, not just in our little kind of small places, right? And she said, in echoing kind of Doreen Massey, right, who talks about the global sense of the local, I think Cynthia said it much better than I could, and even the Massey. She says, this project that you're asking people for, you're asking about how people fit the big world into their small worlds. And I'm going to close with a story from Amanjat, my neighbor just down the street from here. And this is 36th Street in Oakland. And she said, I asked her where she would take me on a guided tour. And she said, well, she was 12 at the time. She said, you know, when you stand out and you see where the freeways are and you can see the sun setting, that part right there. Thank you very much.
Have you gone back and talked to any of the people who gave you guided tours when the places they took you to had disappeared? And how did they feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can explain a little bit more of the process and talk through the whole thing in the talk, but just to, so all of this work started around about 2001. And also kind of, you may know, it was kind of a momentous year and a momentous time for New York City. And so a lot was happening and it really made me think a lot. I'm from New York and it made me really want to do work that, you know, protected and valued and cared for my city. And so this was part of doing that work. So in doing that, I started to ask people first in Prospect Heights, and then about 4 years later, I started in Oakland. But right before I kind of was wrapping up the work in Prospect Heights, a large development that I talk about, this Atlantic Yards development, was both proposed and then started to be built kind of as I had wrapped up the first round of tours and walks and interviews. And at the time I thought to myself, oh man, I just like totally missed the whole interesting thing about this place. I'd been doing this work on kind of a very everyday neighborhood that, much as I loved it and everyone who lives there loved it, it's not important. It doesn't have a big kind of importance. And I thought, wow, I've missed this moment. And one of the things that I realized was that I actually had this archive of work of both photographs and of stories kind of prior to this large development happening. And so when I brought the work back in 2014, and I continued to talk with almost all of my tour guides kind of in that intervening time. But when I started to bring the work back and think about like, well, why would this be an interesting sort of public project? What's at stake in sharing this? Why is it important to other people? I re-interviewed a lot of the people that I had talked with, but also I went back and realized that so many of the places that people had taken me to had gone. And so as part of a project which that those tour guide booklets, I'm going to just go back to those booklets for a second. Those were a partnership between myself, my organization Buscata, and Brooklyn Public Library, and an kind of local community-based organization that had really been PHNDC, that had really been in opposition to Atlantic Yards. And then when that passed, we're really trying to hold developers to account for at least the promises that they had made for affordable housing, which, spoiler alert, very little of that affordable housing has actually been built, and it is 2025. So one of the things that we did was to bring these older stories back in the form of these guidebooks. And then I had reached out to my tour guides, but also in doing this public work, we had started an oral history project so that people would come on these tours, and we had a whole lot of also sort of just public conversations at the library. And after the walks or after the public conversations, people could record their own stories. So it built a whole nother layer of oral histories sort of from 10 years later on top of this. And so there was, and I would say on a lot of these tours, there was a real sense of building capacity for dialogue to talk about the change that had happened in the neighborhood, very often because gentrification and development can happen quite quickly, or people don't sort of notice it until they notice the thing that they care about being gone. And it helped to have these set of walks, both as a kind of make space for people to talk, but also by showing these photographs. We would go to all the sites that were in the photographs. And that became a way, and very often what we were standing in front of was very different than what was in the photograph. And that became a really important way to kind of hold on to and talk about things that are often feel very amorphous or difficult to hold on to. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that people were both upset that the places had changed, but it also was an opportunity both for the people who I had originally interviewed to talk about it, but also for new people who maybe hadn't been there in all of that time, but who were kind of curious or who wanted to think about their neighborhood, wanted to kind of hold on to things, or wanted to recognize what was important or understand what was there, and wanted to be part of something positive in the neighborhood. So that was also an important piece of that whole project.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting in the book you talk about how during those guided tours, you're doing these walking tours and kind of telling the stories that people had told you years before, but you have the participants in the walking tours read out loud the stories. So they like, you're in this place and they are literally trying to inhabit this other person as a way to not only understand the built environment, their neighborhood, but to build empathy. And I think that is kind of a thing that you touch on throughout the book too, about like, you have a couple of people who make comments about like, some people don't know how to be neighbors. They don't know how to talk to people. Like they don't know how to have these kind of, like you said, low stakes interactions. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the intersection Prospect Heights project touched on that like interpersonal kind of community building aspect within this like physical neighborhood environment.
Absolutely. Well, I was just going to show these, just so you all know, this is kind of what these guidebooks looked like. So kind of when people would pick them up around the neighborhood, in the supermarket, in the bodega, and then, in kind of newer bars, that people could find these things all around the neighborhood. And to your point, that I would ask on these walking tours, I would give everybody who came on the tour one person's guidebook, and I'd say, okay, you're going to tell, Julia's stories as we walk around. And as we would walk, we would get to a place that was kind of in Julia's guidebook, and I would ask that person to read her story aloud. And so it really did build this sense of not only am I thinking about this place, but also like if I have to read somebody's story out loud, also like very physically in the place where it was originally told, it brings this kind of embodied aspect of understanding kind of what's at stake, right? It's not abstract, it's really quite physical. Thinking about like where bodies are allowed to be and not, and where people feel comfortable and where they feel safe and free and all of those things. It also, to like that idea of building empathy was very important, and just the idea that you don't that you have to represent somebody else's story in amongst this group of people, right? So you have to do it justice. You have to like read it well. You have to, be caring to something that maybe even you disagree with. But you have been charged with representing that person who's not there right now. And so I think it brought a level of kind of people's responsibility to the whole thing. But then I think also hearing other people's stories read aloud in the beginning of the walks, it would just be about the like the stories that we were reading. People would we'd read the next one and the next one, but kind of halfway through, having heard other people's stories was an opportunity kind of for everyone within the group to start to open up and to share their own experiences, to say, actually, my experience of this place or this, or that reminds me of my relationship to X, Y, and Z. It allowed them to sort of bounce off something else. Somebody, even a story about somebody who wasn't there, which can be actually really helpful, allowed people to kind of unlock and feel like they could say something about their own experiences and share with the group. So I think that process, that building space, I think a lot about this work as building spaces for dialogue. And I think a lot about some of the places that people took me to as really being valuable because there are people who work in those spaces, who facilitate those spaces, and they are people who, for it's not always like highfalutin dialogue, right? It could be the talking trash, but that there are people who facilitate that capacity for connection with other people, and that is not to be taken lightly. And I think that is a really huge part of some of the work that these kinds of places do.
Yeah, and we have a couple of questions in the chat that touch on something that, as a historic preservation nonprofit, we think about a lot is like preserving of places. And I think within the preservation movement over the last several years, there has been more conversation about cultural heritage, intangible heritage, the importance of place, not just because it's like, capital H historic or very beautiful, but because it matters to people, it matters to community. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of either ephemeral places or, these kind of everyday places. Like you talk about these places like it's just kind of like it's a corner shop, it's a supermarket, it's a place that may not be like important, but it's important. So like what is the role of preservation, I guess, in like in those kind of community spaces? Does it matter? Like, do they need to be preserved? Should they be preserved? And what does that kind of preservation look like when it's not necessarily like a historic designation
Sure.
per se?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's actually interesting, even in the context of the neighborhood in Brooklyn, in Prospect Heights, it actually sought a historic designation as neighborhood as as a tool to halt very large scale development. Like it was an activist tool to halt that. So I think that's just that's like a capital P kind of preservation, right? Like this idea of what does that look like to be able to say historic preservation as a means to protect people who live in that place. I think that was an important piece of it. Um, but I think very often, I think a lot about this idea of preservation and what does it look like to preserve the capacities for people to be in a place, and how does preservation, there is a lot of conversation about, well, can historic preservation actually be the thing that saves the building, but then, pushes out the people who actually live there, right? So what is it that preservation needs to do to be able to say, yes, preserve the building, right? The low scale, all of the pieces, right? That kind of in this neighborhood in Brooklyn, but also preserves affordability, right? Also preserves the ways in which small businesses actually have capacity to stay. So I think there's a lot of tools in which that can happen, but I think it's one of those things of thinking about, how does preservationists talk with kind of other kinds of planners and even other kinds of, place-based researchers, to think about, like, well, what's happening in space and how do we protect that? How do we think about those things as being valuable? And I think there is certainly more of a move towards sort of culturally significant spaces. But I would say, which I think is really important, I would say that there's even more of this kind of like, they're not important because they're, you know, culturally important, but they're important to the people and the capacity for building a sense of place in a neighborhood. So how do we start to name that? I wish I had the actual specific answer to that, but I think that to me seems like such an important kind of question. I think some of the practice, like, how do we start to notice the practices and the processes that happen in place, not only the kind of fixed in time sort of physical built environment. One of this picture is from I think it's either the first or the second of an annual basketball tournament, kids tournament, in this park on Dean Street in Prospect Heights. And I just think a lot about the ways in which people make practices, and how do we also support these kinds of ongoing practices, though, that, this particular playground, maybe we can recognize playgrounds and parks as being important, right? That's open space is important, but this particular playground itself is not particularly beautiful. It's not particularly physically significant, but it hosts this whole range of community work that is really significant, and then has been really significant over time. So how do we start to see those kinds of processes, I think, is a huge piece of it. And I think, I think about, this donut shop does still exist, which I think is fantastic. But I think it's also like, well, what is it? There is nothing about this donut shop that is beautiful, or that, I mean, I think it's beautiful, but the stained Formica situation is not a target for historic preservation, and yet it is this place in which, not like big things happen, but almost through a kind of like uh there's a Karen Frank talks about this idea of loose space, right? Or this idea of like, where places that sort of, like, I think this is almost a like benign neglect kind of situation, where like people can kind of do what they will in some of these spaces, and that's actually so powerful. So how do we kind of ensure that spaces are, kind of fluid and flexible, right? That it's not fixed, or fixed in time or in stone. I think those kinds of things are part of what allows a kind of community preservation as well. And I think there's also very simple things like, how do we enable small businesses, which are very frequently right at the edge, um, financially? How do we ensure that, their landlord doesn't double their rent when their 10-year lease is up, right? What does that look like to build in small business protections as well? We're not doing a great job of building in affordable housing protections either, but if we do that, which is clearly very essential to all of this, but that we also see building capacity for affordability for small businesses, and that we recognize their role not only as economic drivers, but also in this sort of work of community preservation, that's another reason that we need to think about, how do we enable people to stay for the long term, to build businesses, and have, businesses change, people's lives change, businesses fail, but that's normal, right? We can't fix
Mhm.
everything in stone. But how do we, for places that want to stay, to have that longevity where a neighborhood really rallies around a place, what is it that allows that place to stay? Because when those places are lost, people feel the ramifications of that for years.
Mhm.
And so I think that becomes such an important, those are important questions for us to start to ask and start to codify.
Yeah, and throughout the book, obviously we're talking about place work, and the issue of gentrification comes up a lot throughout the book. And I think you make a point really early on that I think is important, is that sometimes gentrification is framed as this like inevitability, and it's not. And it's not just about like individuals moving into a place and individuals moving out of a place, but it is very top down. There are policies, there are large scale developers who are like making these grand plans that don't actually include the people of a place. And so, what does it look like to center the community members within like the plans for the neighborhood? Like, how do we make sure that people have a voice and can remain in a place? Like, obviously, places change. And as preservationists, I think the point is not necessarily like frame it and like put it in amber and nothing can change. It's about how people continue using these places and add to that history. But if people are all displaced, then that community ceases to be what it was. So how do we kind of like frame that and make sure that people have the power? Can,
Yeah.
can we do that? Like, what does that policy look like?
I mean, I think that's one of the pieces of this is to say, well, how do we, one of the things that was so exciting to me on some of these walking tours was to make a space for a kind of conversation that really doesn't happen around planning, around development, right? Like, so at a community board meeting or a city council meeting or a town planning meeting, right? You're arguing for, you're arguing against something, as opposed to being able to talk about the meanings of a place and to be able to hear different people's points of view on that. Like, so just take a step back and to be able to do that work, I think is quite important. And I think one of the things that was really important to me in terms of all of those walks was to say, for, as just as you say, people would be said, well, change happens, you can't get mad about it. I was like, well, I can get mad about it, but also, it helps to be able to say, well, let's take a step back. Let's follow the money. Let's track who benefits, right? Let's pull back. And so actually one of the things that I found to be really valuable, in the intersection Prospect Heights work was that partnership. So partnering with kind of in a cultural organization like the library, and also a community activist organization, so that we could think about like, well, we all have an interest in talking about neighborhood change, about preservation, about people's stories, all of those things. That's something that we have a really shared interest in. But then also, how do we use some of this work as tools towards um, uh, larger activism, larger advocacy for people's rights, right? What does that look like to use these tools towards that? And so even as part of the public project, had said that we had had people record their sort of newer oral histories, but we also tracked demographic change. We kind of looked at the rent that had changed over in one apartment over 10 years, and included all of that and some of excerpts from these newer oral histories in kind of a booklet that we released at the end of that public project. And so really to be able to say, like, how do we bring all of these things together into conversation with each other, that, at the root of all of these stories, like, is a deep sense of politics, right? So pretty much everybody, when they talked about these places that were important to them, they were started out very personal, but very quickly got quite politically connected to kind of larger, either, even if it was more political in the sense of a sense of self and a sense of ethics, or directly connected to kind of a larger sort of movement. That kind of work, I think, becomes really important toward thinking about, well, what does it look like to have a city that actually works for people, right? What does that look like, and how do we start to continue to have people, like actually have people weigh in? And I say weigh in, I think it's like, how do we back it up so that it's not like, okay, we have a planning meeting and we talk to the community, which I've been in a lot of those, and they generally are very contentious. And also they are very, you know, do you like this one or do you like this one? Do you like red or do you like blue, right? That's not a deep engagement with understanding people's needs. So how do we shift the norm about like backing it up to thinking about what are people's needs in a place, right? And then how do you communicate? Maybe other needs around, I don't know, climate resilience or anything else that, like, as a city planner, one might be thinking about, right? How do we kind of bring those things together to explain and to make a real space for conversation and dialogue around them? So I think that's the, how do we kind of back up to really a deeper analysis of what cities do for people, and how are we understanding that, and how are we involving neighbors at a really early stage and normalizing that kind of conversation about place, rather
Yeah.
than kind of, we have a very simplistic sort of way that we imagine that planning can engage the community at the moment. Um, and it's really not much of a choice most of the time. And I think that also really, people aren't stupid. They recognize that that's not a choice.
Mhm.
And I think that that causes so much tension by continuing to have that framework around the way that we think about planning.
Yeah. And I think that the intersection Prospect Heights project that you did is a really interesting kind of case study or example that preservationists can take to heart, especially I'm thinking of like survey work. So if people are like going out into community and doing survey of built environment,
Mhm.
I think this could be a really good example of like how do you do that work with a nod to the people too? So I'm wondering if you could give a little bit of advice about like how do you start a project like that? How do
Mm.
you make sure that you are listening to people and getting out there and not just, like you said, presenting like red or blue, which one do you like? But like, what are some tips for people who are kind of doing that really community-based work to feel comfortable doing it in a way that is inclusive?
I think one of the things that I would say, like, I think there are tips in doing this work, but I also think, and kind of in all of this, is like, how do we all across disciplines start to normalize what it is to be collaborative across
Mhm.
disciplines? And like, cities are complicated places, and we need the capacity to talk with each other, right? And so thinking about different kinds of expertise held, like no one person can be the holder of all expertise about, like, I know about cities, right? That's just like not going to happen. But how do we all kind of across this work start to normalize and build shared language to be able to kind of ask for help, to think about what it is to actually collaborate on these kinds of questions? So that's one thing I would say. I think the field of environmental psychology or social ecology, or sometimes kind of um, human ecology, all of that is to really about understanding people's relationship to place and really understanding how people use it and what it does for them, right? And what is it, how do you start to see people's, particularly often in the built environment. So I would say a lot of that really looks at, well, what is it, how do we do deep interviewing with people, deep listening with people's about their experience of place, right? Which is not so dissimilar from practices of oral history or urban anthropology, right? Those things are all deeply interconnected. So I would say that like learning to do that practice of open-ended interviewing is quite important. Because I think, I mean, I don't think that everyone needs to take 20 years on it, but one thing about this project is that I did not go in thinking about, well, what does gentrification mean to you, right? I was interested in understanding how a place worked, right? What was important to the people there? And, and also in the comparison, I started to realize how much, both urban renewal, but also kind of this country's kind of history of discrimination in planning had really shaped both cities, but had come out with very different outcomes in terms of what they physically look like. But there were some really shared histories. So the comparative, I think, is also really helpful. And I would say is also a really helpful thing, especially even thinking about my first book around Contested City, around the Seward Park urban renewal area, which was a failed urban renewal site, which housing activists had really worked for like now actually 50 years to make sure that affordable housing actually got built on that site. One of the things that I think is so important from that is to say, well, how are their collaborations across locations? How do people actually learn from each other, or learn from each other's activism to do that work? So I think that kind of like thinking about what does it look like to prepare ourselves better for collaboration and shared language, and also shared capacity for like really sharing experiences and sharing techniques, I think becomes really important to doing this work. And I think part of obviously that kind of interviewing where you're really thinking about, well, how is it that you listen to people, that you're not just asking them what you want to know, but you're actually listening to what they want to tell you about, because it might be something that you didn't even really think about, right? Think all of the things that we have to we think about positionality, who you are, how do people talk with you? How do you can't change who you are, but you can think about how do you acknowledge that? How do you think about who you are in the world, right? What does that look like, right? And that's all about race and class and gender and all the pieces, right? You cannot be different than who you are, but you can be honest about it, and you can be thinking about how do you open that up? How do you collaborate with people who might see things in a different way, right? So that all of that work, I think, becomes really, really important to this deeper understanding and deeper capacity for like both listening and actually being able to hear what people are telling you. I think that that's another super important part of this work.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, obviously, you're also an artist, you're a photographer, and we have a question about how you view the role of your photography in your work, whether you see it as art or as applied photography in the service of a sociological study. And then, sort of related to that, I'm just kind of curious to hear your take on the importance of, well, if we're talking about collaboration and like getting really multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary views involved, like the role of artist within planning and within, these kinds of conversations, like how can bringing artists into those kind of conversations be really beneficial to whatever it is that you happen to be trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the question of like whether I see them as art or research. I think they're both. This causes lots of problems in my world professionally, but to me, they are both. And I think that they are that idea, like I was saying at the beginning, this idea of like art as a way of knowing and creative practice as a way of knowing. Like I am genuinely trying to find out actual things, and I am also really interested in what does it mean to make a good photograph, and not just a good photograph that, a good photograph like it looks like what it's supposed to look like, but that it is moving, or that you find that you are compelled by it, or that you disagree with it. That's fine too, right? That a photograph itself is as much something with a point of view as a piece of writing is. And I think that those two things are really important. And for me, that sort of methodology, I would say, so, in the both, I would ask people for their tours of their neighborhood, and we would walk and I would record them, or drive. And then I would also photograph the places that people had taken me to. It was really important for me to think about, well, what is it the researcher or artist owes to the person who is sharing their story with them. And one of the things that I think a lot about is that these stories that people tell me, I lived with them for like 20 years and then was like, oh my God, these things have to go in a book. Like they live in my head. But they live in my head because what people gave me was valuable. And, I think the things that I really want to do with this work is like, I wanted to make photographs to say, hey, here's what I heard you tell me. I listened to you and made this photograph based on that story. What do you think? Right. And so very often it's both the fact that you spent any time at all actually paying attention to somebody's story and then went and did something about it. But then also thinking about the particular ways of looking, I think is very important. So there's a really embodied experience of being in place. I think there's a real different kind of interview as like if I had said, where's important to you in your neighborhood? And we were sitting in someone's living room, the story would have been completely different than if we had, or they had been sitting, I don't know, in a kind of public space, like in a, in a meeting room. Um, the stories would have been completely different than if we were walking around. So that embodied storytelling, I think, is super important. Um, but then the qualities of actually thinking about what do photographs do, I take really seriously and, think a lot about not just this work as sort of, I would say it drives me insane when sort of social science or other kinds of fields think about photographs as data because they are framed, they are made by mechanisms, there are lenses, there's all kinds of ways in which this is not like the truth. But that's okay. We can use that if we're conscious of it. And so one of the things I think a lot about is to say, well, what is it that looking at a photograph can do differently as a way of understanding place? So um, kind of helping people look through these photographs, people would be able to talk a little bit about what wasn't in them, um, how very frequently sometimes people loved them, which was always lovely, but I was equally interested in when people were like, I love this photograph, but I have to say, that's not how I think about this place. And I was like, okay, great. Tell me why, right? But you could never say that without the photographed or the object to respond to. So I think there's a lot to be said about, and even the guidebooks and all of this stuff, I think a lot about this. How do we make objects that people can respond to that help them unpack really complicated ideas? So even this is not really an answer to that question about art practice, but in answer to that thing, thinking about planning is that it's really hard to answer these questions. Like, how do you feel about your neighborhood? Like, that's not an easy question to answer. What do you think should be here? I don't know. I have my whole life and like other concerns, right? But if you present people with things to respond to, not the red-blue comparison, but the like, well, here's one thing that we're thinking about this kind of question. What do you think about that? Right? Then it gives people something to respond to, and then they can start to build on that, right? So that idea of research, art practice as exchange, I think is quite important. So all of this work, I really think about it as part of a process of exchange and think about the ways in which photographs or other kinds of art practices can open up kinds of possibilities for conversation um, that sometimes sort of a direct question can't. And so I think that's why it's also a really important and potent part of the idea of really grappling with, how do we use this as part of a larger question of kind of better understanding our cities or planning for people's well-being. Um, so I think that capacity for bringing in something that is experiential, that can in some ways open up a different kind of response, I think is really powerful. And I think that's one of the kinds of things that art practices can do, not always, but can have that possibility for doing.
I love that. And we are at time. And there's so many other topics that we didn't even get to. I loved this book because there were just so so many different paths that we could have gone down. So my advice to everyone in the audience is if you haven't gotten the book, get the book, sit with it, and see what threads really speak to you. But Gabrielle, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today, for writing the book, for doing the research, and sitting on it for 20 years and then putting it out in the world. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And thanks for all of the questions. And it was really, really a pleasure to talk about this work in this context. So thank you all.